After my experience with the doves in Palm Springs, I came back to Minnesota with deep resolve to use the horn as an instrument of peace. It was during the summer of 2003, and a presidential candidate, Dennis Kucinich, was proposing we take 2% from the defense budget and apply it to a Department of Peace. This was met with outrage from a culture addicted to fighting. That summer, the NPR commentator Scott Simon did a program about events in Fairmont, Minnesota. There was a small group of women who asked the city council to endorse the creation of a Department of Peace. That endorsement passed without fanfare. However, the following week the council chambers were packed with people furious about creating such a department. The very word peace had been promoted by the fighters as soft. The message seemed loud and clear. America was a strong fighting nation, and all the money should stay for fighting rather than conflict resolution. Later that summer, I changed the name from Horns for Peace to Horns for Healing. It seemed to make more sense that most of us would be for healing and wholeness. Peace had become a dirty word to so many. In 2007, I traveled to Virginia Tech to tone the horn for healing. 1 week after the deep wounding from one of our first mass shootings, it was still too early for words. Students silently placed their messages of regret and love on banners, honoring the fallen. There were no spoken words, as only the horn broke the silence. The healing from this deep wounding continues today as more and more mass shootings occur during these troubled times. Until we can put focus on meeting violence with the skills of conflict resolution and intentions to deep understanding, I suspect these shootings will increase. Wisdom would show us how unproductive it is to meet violence with more violence. Yet, this seems to be our cultural narrative, and it prevents us from meeting violence with an open mind and a desire to find common sense through deep listening. Whether it's in our community, state, nation, or international relations, the greatest courage is required when we set intention, ability, willingness with full attention to understanding and empathizing with our perceived enemy. This goes a long way toward how we start our day. We can pledge allegiance to fighting, or we can pledge allegiance to nonviolence. We can sing songs of fighting, or we can sing songs of gratitude and joy. America, the Beautiful captures the song I would like us to sing in honor to the gifts and opportunity from this great land. There are those who would claim this is similar to defunding the police. Nothing could be further from the truth. It's about balance. Former President Dwight Eisenhower warned about the damage to our nation from an unchecked military complex. Our first Republican, Abraham Lincoln, warned about the demise of our country when only a few of extreme wealth control the direction. Today's annual military budget is close to $1 trillion. Those institutions dedicated to healing, conflict resolution, and the delicate skills needed in war prevention are under attack, and our current Secretary of Defense pushes for a Department of War. Common sense would have us push for a Department of War Prevention. The longest-serving Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, asserted that the #1 military rule for success is to empathize with the enemy. When we don't seek understanding for the actions of those we are ready to fight, we make huge mistakes costing thousands of lives. After the Vietnam War, McNamara realized it was not a war about democracy versus communism. It was a civil war, and we should have never engaged in it in the first place. The second longest-serving Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, carried the notion that we could take actions on incomplete information. He claimed that there were known unknowns, and this led us to our first preemptive war in Iraq on the false assumption that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction ready to use. It's quite clear that meeting violence with violence seldom works, and further leads to collateral damage that intensifies the problem. It was my hope that our legislative leaders could sit together in silence and just admit They don't have all the answers before they start pushing for violence. It was my hope that members from opposing political parties could sit side by side instead of as adversaries across an aisle. It was my intention to ask why legislators from different political parties will no longer socialize with each other, as they did in previous administrations. I saw our nation breaking apart from a lack of empathy. When the desire to fight comes from an addiction to more money and more power, it spreads, and our sensitivity to collateral damage dissipates. In the spring of 2020, we were blessed with a golden retriever whose love helped get us through the tragedy of our pandemic. At just 10 months of age, he started howling when I sounded the trumpet. Now, for more than 4 years, each morning we break the silence of the morning with his howling and my trumpet toning. The intention is to healing and wholeness, to non-violence. We have traveled to our state capital numerous times to sound the horn for healing, to hold intention for healing, and to make a plea for non-violence instead of turning up the volume for arguing, debate, yelling, persuasion, and all the harm that comes from angry speech. We continue to suffer the deep wounds from mass shootings, from politically motivated shootings, and from a media that is addicted to covering violence rather than focusing on the common sense need for listening and healing. When our Minnesota legislator and her husband were assassinated, the assassin had a hit list for many of the Democratic legislators. The assassin was a byproduct of our violent media and culture. The golden retriever was an instrument of peace and love. It was very touching that when the shooter assassinated the Hortmans' golden retriever, Gus, their loving dog, was allowed to lay in state with them. At the public remembrance held at the Capitol grounds Mojo, my golden retriever and I sounded the horn and howled for healing. The mass shootings and the politically motivated shootings continue, and it would be impossible to sound the horn or to howl at each of these events as much as we would like. But we do sound the horn and howl for healing for all those who have been robbed of opportunity, who have lost access in their ability to participate, whether it be through gun violence, laws that violate people's right of opportunity, and sycophants afraid to speak to non-violence for fear of losing their power or wealth. It would seem that now more than ever, it would behoove us to get bigger than the problems that seem so big, to temporarily surrender our notions of being right, of asking about collateral damage first before taking actions of violence on others. It would be a time to surrender our fighting and violence, a time to practice the wisdom and teachings of our spiritual teachers, of practicing the golden rule.